Good evening, good morning, everyone. I'm Joanna Cohn, Director of the Institute for Global Tobacco Control at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. And I'm welcoming you to our monthly Innovations in Tobacco Control seminar series. I'm delighted today to be able to introduce two researchers for this presentation, and I'll introduce each of them in turn. So first, Dr. Tingzhong Yang, MD, professor and director of the Center for Tobacco Control Research at Zhejiang University School of Medicine in China. Dr. Yang is a member of the expert group for the National Association on Tobacco Control, and he is also on the review committee for Science and Technology Awards of the National Education Ministry and Chinese Preventive Medicine Association. He has been an advisor for the World Health Organization regarding tobacco control policies and programs for students in the health professions. And his primary research interests are in tobacco control. He has conducted a series of projects on tobacco control advocacy capacity that covered all provinces in China, including more than 70 cities. And he's published more than 100 international papers in journals. Dr. Yang's research on tobacco control was selected as one of the university's research highlights at the celebration of Zhejiang University's 120th anniversary celebration. And he has been the Asian editor of the American Journal of Health Behavior, and he's currently editor for the journal Pollution and Public Health. And I'll say Dr. Yang's research in tobacco control goes back decades. He's been committed to this topic of research and action for many years, and he's really a wonderful collaborator. So welcome, Dr. Yang. And I'd also like to introduce Dr. Xiaozhao Yousef Yang, who's an associate professor at the School of Sociology and Anthropology at Yat-sen University in China. And he's a fellow of the university's 100 Talents Project. Before joining Yat-sen University, he worked at Murray State University in Kentucky as an assistant professor of sociology. And previous to that, he was at Purdue University's Center on Religion and the Global East and the Center on Young People's Health. Dr. Yang received his PhD and Master's of Science degrees in sociology from Purdue University and a Bachelor of Law degree from Zhejiang University. Dr. Yang's research investigates how supra-individual contextual factors shape individuals' health behaviors, particularly risky health behaviors such as substance abuse and sex work patronage. He is particularly interested in understanding the mechanisms through which contextual factors exercise their impact on individuals and their behaviors. His research activities have been funded by a range of organizations, including the China Medical Board and Rockefeller Foundation, Guangdong Social Science Foundation, the John Templeton Foundation, and Key Philosophy and Social Science Base of Shaanxi Province. His research has been published in leading sociology and public health journals, including Social Science and Medicine, Sociology of Health and Illness, the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, and Tobacco Control and Nicotine and Tobacco Research. He teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in sociological theories as well as research methods. So welcome to you, Dr. Yang. I'm so pleased that both of you are here to talk to us about unassisted smoking cessation in China. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Cohen, for the introduction. So I'm just going to jump into the the topic for today now. So we're going to talk about the policy implication of unassisted smoking cessation among Chinese smokers. This is a quite long, almost a decade-long project by the Center for Tobacco Control Research at Zhejiang University when I was still a student back there, but then gradually I moved on to sociology, but I still was part of the project together with Dr. Yang. So we're going to talk about the policy evidence and the policy applications. What does it mean if a lot of people, they rely on unassisted cessation for quitting instead of a medical intervention? What does that mean for culturally appropriate tobacco control policy framework for today's China? Okay, so first we're gonna go very briefly through the assisted smoking cessation service, which is really popular around the world since the end of the last century. It has been gradually introduced to China as well. So a lot of studies have found smoking cessation interventions greatly increase quit rates, also increase the successful rate for the cessation. Providing help to quit smoking is one important measures of the FCTC framework by the WHO. And we know that a lot of countries, both in the West and other countries in third world of the global South, adopted smoking cessation interventions as part of the tobacco control framework designed with the WHO. Many in Western countries, a lot of the smokers receive formal help in their attempt to quit from, they receive help from health professionals in established clinic, in hospitals with professional services. A lot of those are by physicians, certified physicians. They give them this medical intervention, sort of a technological help to quit smoking through proxy products such as nicotine pack and so on. But the thing is, cessation clinics has been built in China for many years. It's part of the government's tobacco control program. We know that China also signed the FCTC framework with WHO. But only a very small number of smokers have ever visited them. For example, in Hangzhou in 2009, we did the study found that there's only, although there are 19 smoking quit clinics, very, very few people visit them. There are a few clinics that has recorded only one visitor per month, abysmal number of visitation. In Beijing, while there are 22 clinics in 1996, only 3 have survived due to the lack of visitors. In some other places like Hefei City, the hotline was established in 2015. The result was pretty much the same. The hotline barely exists anymore. In Jiangxi province, the hotline was established a little bit earlier, before 2009, before the World Smoke-Free Day. It has recorded only 9 calls in total over a 6-month period. That's a very terrible record for medically intervened cessation service. It's pretty disheartening, to be honest. So facing this phenomenon, we try to explain that by looking into the contextual factors of why people refuse or are reluctant to adopt this medical intervention for their smoking cessation. In other words, why more people still rely on assisted cessation? And is it hopeful for us as tobacco control, either policymakers or practitioners, to explore the potential of unassisted cessation techniques? We give a positive answer. We believe unassisted cessation is very important. It's culturally appropriate. So begin to talk about a little background on that. We make this seemingly generalization about the Chinese culture, but I'm going to into the next few slides to explain why this is not a generalization or stereotype. It has some theoretical foundation in there. These phenomena, the lack of utilization of formally established medical intervention for cessation may reflect the Chinese culture. That the Chinese culture still adheres to excuse me, agrarian social norms that makes Chinese people unaccustomed to dealing with problems such as smoking by the means of irrational and instrumental methods. The prevailing rational motive for action in China is not measured by a means-end rationality. It's not an instrumental rationality. Instead, the culture emphasizes a lot on traditionalism and a harmony in social relationships. Therefore, traditional rationality and the charismatic willpower are very much praised or elevated to an important position in the daily life world of the Chinese people. Just very briefly explain the theoretical background because it has some sociology in there. So basically, we all do actions in our daily life, and every single piece of our action needs to be rationalized, no matter what you do, right? Even the most terrible murder, they will give you some reason why they conduct this terrible crime. It's a rationalization of actions. So actions, unlike behavior, it requires meaning. Behavior is feeling hungry and go to eat. That's a automatic behavior. But feeling hungry and to go to eat dim sum and choose dim sum over McDonald's is an action because dim sum has some symbolic meaning associated with that. Another example, during Ramadan, you're feeling hungry, but you still refrain from eating during the daytime. That's also an action. It's not a behavior. So action has meaning in there. Culture, so our culture, induce some symbolic meaning and socially imposed constraints that lead people to adopt certain types of action to achieve the same object over other types of action. For example, symbolic meaning could be important. People seek medical intervention. In some contexts, especially we're talking about the Chinese context, if you seek medical intervention for your smoking problem, it may suggest you have a weak will or you lack spiritual power to do something. The symbolic meaning of medical intervention is negative in that case. And also you have social constraints, which is the repeated evidence about the chance of a success or failure in conducting certain actions. When you have faced, when you go to do the same thing and face repeated failure to do that thing, you will gradually sort of fall back because you meet the social constraint against your odds of doing that. Okay, so this is very famous sociologist, Max Weber. He talked about how different civilizations have a prevailing philosophies, and that prevailing philosophies may promote certain types of rational actions over other rational actions. For example, in the very famous book, Protestant Ethics and the Capitalist Spirit, he talked about how Calvinist, this reformist idea of a divine calling, rationalize unlimited working without spending or consumption. So the stereotypical example comes to mind instantly is in Balzac's novel, The Pep Gorilla, or the modern time, Steve Jobs or Elon Musk works a lot, accumulates lots of money, doesn't really spend much, just for the sake of growing the business over and over. In the Chinese Orthodox philosophy, however, Confucianism, it extols this worldly devotion and the justified hedonist enjoyment of one's works, which means under this mindset, people focus on this world achievement and the instant consumption of that achievement. So there's no other world destination. There's no such idea of a heaven or external salvation, something like that. So no external instrumental means can be reliably thought of, neither religious or scientific. Now this sounds like stereotype, but it's actually not. We're going to explain a little bit in the next two slides. So before we move to unassisted smoking. So the mode of prevailing cultural elements does not determine individuals' freedom of a choice, right? Everyone is free to choose whatever actions they want to take. But the prevailing cultural elements or this context, it constrains your opportunity structure in which some actions are more likely to be extolled, promoted, praised, or encounter success as a result. right? So this theory on how people rationalize an action speaks about a collective pattern under the influence of a culture. It doesn't speak about individual behaviors. We leave enough room for people to choose their individual choices. So what does that mean for action? This traditionalism in Chinese culture, Weber argues that this worldly hedonistic action leads to traditionalism. You will find a great tendency, a inertia against changing the institution for metaphysical causes. That's why you don't have religious war in China. Neither do you have scientific revolution of a larger scale, because those are metaphysical, something out of this world. It's an external, not a non-mundane way to improve your life. Fond of making money for enjoyment, but not for the sake of profiting alone. So that's why this real life comedy, Extreme Cheapskates, probably wouldn't make a hit in China. Then you also this is another political implication. You will have a pacifist empire, which is unlikely to provoke war, but it demands traditional ritualistic submission from the neighboring countries. And also, just quickly skim over here. There's no external otherworldly salvation, no God from above. Salvation only comes from this world alone and by your own effort alone. This cultural implication is vast for smoking cessation. So think about it in terms of Chinese religion, like Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, Guru Nanak, and other, this super mundane, extraterrestrial God or God figure. In China, there's no such a figure. All gods are essentially human beings. So human beings are just as gods are human. As long as a human being can achieve the god status through their own action, right? So this picture is actually people worshiping Mao Zedong as a god. So there's quite an interchange between god and human. So finally, back to smoking thing. What does it mean for smoking cessation? If we follow that cultural ideology, that mentality outlined by Max Weber, the Orthodox Chinese cultural religion constrains the means to one's life solution via. It emphasizes these worldly means to an end. So there's no other way of achieving your life goal other than means that you can be found on this world. So no external foreign means, no ascetic means. So all methods must be initiative or voluntary, not imposed by external entities, such as a modern hospital or modern clinic setting. Harmonious and traditional in regards to these worldly relationships. If these all stand, then the opportunity structure we have spoken about allow or kind of constrains smokers to do the following things. First, forego external intervention to solving their own tobacco addiction. Intervention has to come from within, or a solution has to come from within. Tend to consider medical intervention to be foreign and external, or instrumental, and tend to develop a distaste of sudden changes from the traditional action patterns. A sudden change facilitated by medical intervention or medical professional help tend to be viewed as a sudden change from the existing smoking pattern. For harmony, the smokers, they often voluntarily, quote unquote, voluntarily succumb to relational pressure over their own interests. They tend to quit smoking because a suggestion or pressure comes from their spouse or girlfriend, and so on. So we don't argue that Chinese smokers prefer unassisted cessation or the culture determines. This is not a cultural determinism. Instead, what we argue is the prevailing cultural context or cultural orthodoxy largely limited the favorable chance of other cultural toolkits, so that smokers in China eventually find unassisted smoking more viable and culturally more sensitive and proper. Data has actually suggested this is the case. By no means we're suggesting Chinese culture is one ironclad, doesn't change it. Neither do we suggest it applies to any race or ethnicity. For example, I don't think the argument would still hold to overseas Chinese or Asian Americans living in a different culture. So largely we're talking about this mainland East Asia, China placed in East Asia. For example, so the evidence shows, apart from what we have shown before, the utilization of medical cessation is very, very abysmal. In 2019, we did a study showing that self-reliance, automatic behavior, and convenience were cited as three key factors to shape people's perception of a smoking cessation service. So essentially, we asked why they're unwilling to seek medical professional help. People talked about self-reliance. It may reflect their feeling that they were able to solve their own problem on their own. It's a masculine thing. It's a culturally appropriate thing to rely on yourself other than seeking external modern medical services. Similarly, automatic behavior, it's a reflexive habit, similar to self-reliance in a way that it highlights the tendency of smokers to not consider smoking cessation services when attempting to quit. This could also reflect that smokers are unaware of the presence of a cessation aid, or if they were ever aware of them, they view such services as being irrelevant or external to their needs. Convenience, we consider convenience to be the convenience excuses to be just an excuse, misperception, because we did qualitative study and also found even when a cessation clinic is built in the vicinity of these people with good transportation, good traffic access, people still are reluctant to try. So convenience issue may also just be an excuse for their distaste of instrumental means to help with their addiction. In the real world, cessation is very important. It largely relates to the end game, as we talked about in tobacco control. Smoking rates in China, 27.7% overall, but male smoking rate, we all know that is over half of the male population in China smokes, 52.1%. But on the positive side, we also have an increasing number of quits over the years. In 1996, 30 million smokers ceased smoking. That is 9% of all smokers. In 2002, 12% of all smokers have quit smoking. That amounts to 42 million of them. 2010, 61 million. That's almost 17% of all smokers. In 2015, 70 million smokers quit. That's about almost 19%, 1/5 of the smokers. That's a great positive trend to observe in the years coming. However, among the successful quit, only 3.1 and 3.2, generally a little bit over 3% reported having ever used medical intervention or consultancy. Large majority of them, 87.9% of them reported the main cessation route is unassisted cessation. So some key factors may influence the adoption of unassisted cessation. Study found that self-control is basically a similar concept to self-efficacy is positively associated with quitting smoking unassisted. Unassisted quitting is also a manifestation of personal will. Concepts such as willpower. Study in Canada also found similar. Willpower was cited as a key reason among successful quitting in Chinese Canadian men, among Chinese Canadian men. It symbolizes a masculine virtue of strength and self-control and so on. To tell people you're addicted to nicotine or to tobacco is quite stigmatizing. So the author in the study cited above, the Mao and the Botov 2016 study, the authors noted there's a tendency among Chinese men to deny physiological addiction, also reject the medicalized image of smoking. For these people, addiction is not a physiological issue. They tend to see that as a psychological issue of themselves. So they would frame that as themselves being psychologically addicted to the feeling of smoking. And then also in that way see themselves as able to control their health behavior as long as that mindset change. Why unassisted cessation can be successful in China particularly. Our study found close to 100%, 97.6% of equators used unassisted cessation, much higher than what was found anywhere else. There's a huge amount of literature talking about unassisted smoking, both in China and elsewhere, especially in Western countries. The success rate is nowhere as high as in China. Unassisted cessation pattern fits Chinese cultural norm. Chinese people often rely on spirit, perseverance, it's willpower, sort of a traditional rationality to deal with their behavioral problems, and refuse to accept their behavioral problem as a medicalized issue that we have talked about earlier in the context of Max Weber sociology stuff. One of our study found social ecological mechanism in smoking cessation. It's determined smokers' behaviors determined by individuals' belief and also the tobacco control environment. So for a successful unassisted cessation, personal willpower is important. Their realization of a need to stop smoking is important. But what's more important on the paramount level is tobacco control environment. We found that higher self-control, the self-efficacy definitely is important, but secondhand smoking environment is negatively associated with unassisted quitting success. Exposure to anti-tobacco information was positively associated with unassisted quitting success. This speaks back a little bit to one point in this traditional rationality, where people emphasize relational harmony in order to do something. They value relational harmony a lot. And I mentioned that a lot of the relational pressure to quit smoking comes from wives and girlfriends. But also think about this. When almost 52% of Chinese men are smokers, a counter pressure also comes from your friends, your smoking friends. That environment may counterbalance the positive pressure against smoking that comes from family members, wives and girlfriends. So tobacco control environment is definitely very important, especially in a context where people value relational harmony. So how to apply that to a policy? We want to emphasize that for unassisted smoking cessation, the policy should aim at reducing population level prevalence. First of all, unassisted quitting is compatible with Chinese culture. We talk about this a lot. And unassisted smoking is a public health policy issue. Smoking is in epidemic proportion. It's not an individual problem. The existing medical intervention, assisted cessation technique, it typically adopt the rationale, a reasoning that individual can be individually treated. Right, so see that logic, right? So individual addicts can be individually treated, so we need to offer them medical services. But for public health, a population health issue, individual means Even individual means borrowed from modern technology with established evidence can hardly help curb the population level epidemic. Right? So we need to develop a national approach, a collective strategy of dealing with the population health issue. A similar tendency in research, such as facilitating quitting smoking using smartphone apps, it's still a individualized approach. It may help with individuals' success story of quitting, but for the national level, collective pattern of addiction, we might look somewhere else. So we suggest that we urgently need a collective means to promote cessation awareness and achieve a group effect. And unassisted cessation would fit more closely in this approach over individualistic medical intervention. Mass education can be important. That can increase awareness. Behavioral susceptibility theory argues if a given behavior becomes inconvenient or difficult, it will gradually decline. So we suggest to increase environmental restriction, tax increase, for example, to largely increase the difficulty of smoking. Banning tobacco commercials can also reduce the cues people will perceive from the smoking environment. Okay, how am I doing in time? Almost. Okay. So like we have talked about, the vast majority of Chinese male smokers rely on unassisted method to quit smoking. Success prevalence is pretty high, which is beneficial to population health. Evidence also suggests that unassisted methods contribute to successful quitting on the part of 70 million smokers in China. It's very significant in terms of the total epidemic. For example, our project, we use education to promote unassisted cessation. We teach and also integrate in textbook among public health students. When they gradually go to society, when they graduate, they become doctors or physicians or policymakers, they can spread the possibility and the method of unassisted cessation to either patients or to the community. Okay, challenges. The government is driven by number. They only look at the statistics. And unassisted smoking cessation is a gradual process. This is also the fact that China, not only Chinese government, I think it's government overall, globally, they're all driven by numbers. So that's also the reason why individual approach is more popular because it's visible. You can see the result quite instantly. For a group collective project, we need to convince policymakers to pay attention to its potential. The above discussion, a caution is that the above discussion is about smoking cessation in the community. Clinical treatment is originally an individual approach. Assisted cessation should be an integral part of the disease treatment and the responsibility of the physician. We do not in any way, by no means, devalue the importance of individual patients or the value, the utility of assisted smoking cessation. But on the other hand, we believe that unassisted cessation and assisted cessation could be complementary. They are targeted at a different ecological level. One is individual level, the other is the collective community level. We still have a tobacco-free campus network. Our website is tfcampuschina.com. It's available in both Chinese and in English, highlighted and documented our achievements and the sort of the roadmap to tobacco-free campus building in China. And some of the contents we talk about in the slides, and the contents not mentioned in the slides, but may also be important, can be found in our new book, Smoking Environments in China, published by Springer 2020, last year, 2021. Thank you for your time. I welcome both me and Dr. Yang would welcome any questions or comments of any sorts for us to discuss. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. That was a really helpful presentation. So folks, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box. And maybe I'll just get started as people are typing up their questions. And you sort of alluded to this towards the end about the role of health professionals in tobacco control. And I know you've done work with health professional students and supporting them in tobacco control efforts. So given what you spoke about and, related to the culture, sociology of smoking and behavior change, what role do you see there's a role for health professionals in talking with people about smoking and smoking cessation, or is it similar to the other interventions that maybe it's just not the most effective way to go in China?
Yeah, does Dr. Yang want to answer this question? I mean, I can chime in. Maybe I would say health professional are definitely very critical, a critical chain in this entire link from health education to their field when they actually graduate and go to become a policymaker or community physician, some sort of that. But given a cultural context, I think one issue with the health professional is they have very limited power other than doing their own individualistic approach of helping patients. That's partly also why assisted cessation is more popular. Medical intervention is way more popular when it comes to the practical works. They have very limited role they can do in order to change the status quo of doing things, especially when the hospital is governed in or sort of a hierarchical, bureaucratical organization. I don't know if I answered the question.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. So we have some questions in the Q&A, and one person's asking, so you had said that the tobacco control environment is thus very important in the opportunity structure for helping people take the action to quit smoking. So, and then part of that tobacco control environment is higher prices of cigarettes through taxes. So the question is about high taxes and the impact on reducing individual smoking. And is that a strategy that has worked well in China? And I think that's something that you do recommend.
Sure, that's a great question. Dr. Cohen, I know you do some research on tobacco tax, right? I think you published with one guy from Zhejiang University in tobacco control. I think it was maybe last year. I read that article. It's a great article. I think also you guys mentioned in that paper and a reality check in the practice of the tobacco control in China is increasing tax. It doesn't work. We have evidence it works other places. We have evidence it works in China. It worked in China. The one issue is tax revenue from tobacco is astronomically high in many places in China, especially a few inland provinces. For a few provinces, almost 40 to 50% of their entire budget comes from tobacco tax revenue. So they want to increase tax, but they do not want to kill the industry because they thrive on that industry. That creates a dilemma, a quandary, sort of the government. They want to find equilibrium where they can extract resource, but also keep the industry thriving. So that's an issue, I think. Uh, 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 the sort of the contradiction I think this commenter made here.
Great, thank you. Yeah, that's good. We and we do have more questions. So the next question, again, is about an appropriate approach to help people who smoke quit. So this person is saying it appears that a cessation approach that is more culturally appropriate would highlight how smokers' behavior or their smoking is a logical response to desire or a psychological attachment. And this attachment generates an overall imbalance. And thus the required action would be quitting smoking. So if you agree with that reasoning, do you think there's a way to promote smoking cessation in a way that would touch on regaining balance?
That's a great question. It's also a tough question to answer. I think the balance, let me see. I'm not quite sure what is implied by balance. What does balance mean?
Well, or maybe it relates to the idea of harmony that you talked about, or like what, just sort of thinking through more how to promote quitting. And I guess the next question too is about so I think you made a strong case that unassisted smoking cessation is appropriate in China. And you showed us tremendous numbers of people who have quit, and vast and almost all from unassisted cessation. So how can we, I guess the question, what are ways to support that even more? What can we do to be even more effective in motivating unassisted smoking cessation, both from a sort of traditional sort of public health tobacco control perspective, but maybe even from your expertise in sociology related to, some of the sort of theoretical approaches that you discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for interpreting that question and also reframe that for me. The thing is, I think this culturally sensitive approach. In this approach, we're not trying to argue that the culture determines something. We're not trying to say that when people keep smoking, there's a reason behind that. So the culture justify smoking. Bear in mind that the culture can be used to justify smoking just as well as it can be used to justify quitting. That's what we mean by the culturally appropriate context. So the culture creates an opportunity structure, but it doesn't determine anything. It doesn't lead you to smoking, or it doesn't lead you to quitting either. But within that opportunity structure, you can choose available resources to help you justify this, either cognitive balance or cognitive congruence, some other related concept, to finally arrive at that quitting action. In order to achieve this quitting action, I think we need to utilize its opportunity structure provided by the culture, and combine that with policy to make it happen. That's why we don't see a opportunity structure in Chinese culture ample with a favorability towards medical intervention. We definitely can rely on medical intervention for cessation, but the opportunity structure offered by the culture seem to, we see the chance to be slimmer. So even to promote that to the next level, we need policy to recognize that first. The danger, like I think we talked about that in another seminar. The danger is not utilizing culture or stereotyping culture. the danger is ignoring the possibility that the culture can afford us to achieve public health goals. So I think we need to, at policy level, we need to recognize that possibility and find a compatibility, a point, kind of a conjoint point between culture and the policy, such as if we do unassisted cessation, where do we spread that message? We spread that message, I believe, that's my personal opinion. Dr. Yang may disagree to a certain level. I think we start at community. We start at community at the grassroots level. We mobilize students. So the next generation wouldn't be affected by the smoking epidemic as much as the previous one. And these students, they can spread the message, they can feedback to their parents. Like when Israel was established, the kids taught their parents to study, to relearn Hebrew, something like that. So I think that's a very important generation. So that's why we focus on tobacco-free campus, where educated, knowledgeable students, they offer us an opportunity window to sort of seize the end game strategy. Okay.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so building on those relationships, changing the norms, having the new generation sort of focus more on the non-smoking norms. It sounds like that's something that you might be recommending. I'm going to jump one question just so to stay on this same topic of motivating unassisted smoking cessation. So this next question is about the high social acceptance of smoking in China. And so there is, as an example, there's a culture of gifting cigarettes among holidays and weddings and other events, and as forms of respect. So giving cigarettes as gifts to others. So the question is, to what extent do you think these norms reinforce smoking and act counter to smokers' partners asking them to quit? And is this, sort of how did these broader norms play in relation to, friends and society reinforcing smoking versus like reinforcing not smoking? So I don't know if you want to talk about some of these cultural norms that reinforce smoking, and whether you think those are things that we should try to change through policy or other means, or whether whether you think they're more effective strategies to support unassisted smoking cessation.
It's a great question. We see actually in the field. In terms of gifting cigarettes, we actually just did a study with my colleague. We had that paper out. I think it was accepted yesterday. What a time. First, I would say it's definitely a very culturally specific phenomenon, because people can totally exchange other gifts. Why do they have to exchange cigarettes? That has to have some cultural reason there. But beyond that cultural reason, we also see a very universal pattern in gifting cigarettes. The amount and the value, the monetary value you give out, almost equal the amount and the monetary value you receive. So it's it fits very closely to the famous universal anthropological phenomenon called the generalized chain of social exchange. What you give out always comes back to you. So in that sense, I think gifting cigarettes is both cultural specific, but also the exchange pattern is universal. That reinforces smoking by dragging people into that exchange chain, that circle of obligation, right? So I receive cigarettes. Now I'm obligated to give it out. Then next person receive that, it's obligated to give it out. So this is sort of an endless recycling of cigarettes. How do we change that? So I think part of the question is that a counterforce to smokers' partner. It's definitely a counterforce. Typically, the people involved in the exchange are male, but we also find females and non-smokers. I think I can't quite recall the exact number, but it's like 13% of non-smokers also are involved in the exchange. They only exchange for, to build social capital instead of smoking by themselves. But it's huge. It's a tremendous number. How to change that issue? I think the government of the China government, a few years ago, I think it was 3 years ago, they had a sort of a policy require the maximum price for a pack of cigarettes to not exceed 100 yuan. That's about $15. When the gift doesn't worth as much, people wouldn't exchange that because it doesn't show the value, extravaganza value of your gift. It has worked in other fields for alcohol. They have also limited the price of alcohol. After that dictum, the sale of alcohol dropped a lot, especially the sale for people to buy that as a gift. Yeah, I think we do have policy measures to stop that, even though it's a cultural specific phenomenon. But we still have, like I said, beyond that, we have a universal pattern. We cannot change the culture, but we can intercede the universal pattern in that. Yes, that would be what I think it would.
Thank you. Yeah, very interesting, because in many, let's say in this country, we're talking about minimum prices for cigarettes. So they cost a certain amount, but it's it's expensive enough. But I understand, it's a very good point because there's a huge range in prices of cigarettes in China, and there are the much more expensive ones, exactly as you say, which adds value to them. So maybe, that's really interesting. So I think we'll end with one more question. Let me just jump back to climate change. I don't know if you're able to answer this, but I know there's some interest in the environment and pollution. So the question is about whether tobacco use influences climate change and how we can tackle it, if you care to answer that.
I can only answer that briefly. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not sure. I don't know for a fact if the growth of tobacco leaves, how does that affect the climate? How does that affect the temperature change? But I think we do have a general tendency, a trend among the governments at different levels to adopt a net zero emission policy, both in China and outside China. But I think they started to change that as well. After the global fuel price has increased, China decided, screw it, we're not going to spend more money. We're going to switch back to coal and something like that. But that's all I know. I'm not sure about how tobacco influenced that.
Yeah, actually, I see another couple. Let me just try and squeeze in another. I think this question is about government supporting the growing production, manufacturing, and supplying of tobacco products. And so how do, I guess, well, I don't want to necessarily interpret the question, but I mean, that's certainly a challenge and part of the broader environment as well, with the government being sort of the tobacco company, and how that, and I mean, from work that we and others have done, we're seeing, nationalistic and Chinese culture specific images on cigarette packs. So, it's a real challenge when the government, is in this case, directly benefiting, is in the business of selling cigarettes. And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that role and how we deal with that moving forward.
That's very important question for even if we cannot answer that by now, but it's some question for us to ponder about. My reaction, typically the first reaction to a question like this is I acknowledge that fact. It's pretty pessimistic when your government is a big corp that relies 40%, 50% of its income from tobacco industry. That's a huge issue, and likely you wouldn't be able to change what the government decides in their economic benefit, economic interests. But also, I think bear in mind that the not only the Chinese government, but essentially all governments, especially if it's a large country, it is comprised of multiple factions. They don't always have unified interests. Definitely, the economic interest from tobacco industry lies in that the specific bureaucracy. What is that called there? Dr. Yang, do you recall the name for 国家烟草收烟税的那个部门叫什么？国家烟草烟草局？国家税务。Okay, so both the tax department and there's a special faction called the National Tobacco Administration Department, whatever that's called. It's a rough translation. They have aligned interests, but then you have the administration of health. It's a separate interest group. We cannot say they have aligned interest in that case. So what we can do is mobilizing the interests, mobilizing these policymakers from the departments or factions that have no aligned interest with tobacco industry, such as the public health, the administration of health. It's very doable. It's actually why and how we do tobacco control advocacy in China.
I'm sorry, we're at time, and I want to thank the speakers very much for the presentation and really focusing on the environment for tobacco control. I think there aren't many researchers in China that take that perspective, and it's really important and very innovative work that you've been doing and publishing. So I want to thank you in general for your contributions to this area of research and also for your wonderful presentation today. So thanks very much.
Thanks for having us, Dr. Cohen. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully we will keep on the collaboration in future and doing environmental research on tobacco control in China. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you all. See you next month.
See you.